I never expected my life to change the way it did. When my mother remarried, I thought we would finally have some stability, a fresh start after years of struggling. My stepfather, Daniel, seemed like the perfect man, charming, supportive, and always willing to help around the house. He treated my mother like a queen, and for a while, I thought we were lucky to have him. At first, he was nothing but kind to me, always asking about my day, my schoolwork, and my dreams for the future. It felt nice to have someone care. But as time passed, something about his presence started to unsettle me. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things. The way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he always found reasons to be near me, brushing past me in the hallway, lingering in the kitchen when I was alone. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, he had never done anything inappropriate. He was just being friendly, wasn't he? But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air around him felt heavier. His smile lingered a second too long. Even when he spoke to my mother, I sometimes caught him glancing at me, as if there was something unspoken between us. One evening, I was in my room, scrolling through my phone, trying to push away the uneasy thoughts that had been clouding my mind. My mother had gone to bed early, exhausted from work. The house was quiet. Then, I heard it, the slow creak of my bedroom door opening. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head just slightly, enough to see his silhouette in the dim light. My stepfather stood there, unmoving, his hand still on the doorknob. My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure he could hear it. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to be asleep, hoping he would just leave. But he didn't. I felt the room shift as he stepped inside. The sound of his breath was barely audible, but I knew he was close. Every muscle in my body tensed. My fingers gripped the blanket so tightly my knuckles turned white. I forced myself to breathe slowly, evenly, terrified that any movement would give me away. And then, just as suddenly as he had come, he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and the air felt lighter again. I waited a long time before opening my eyes, staring at the dark ceiling, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. Why had he been there? What did he want? And why did it feel like something was just beginning? The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of unease. I kept replaying the night before, trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe he had just checked on me, like any caring stepfather would. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was no reason for him to be there, standing in the darkness, watching me. I pushed the thoughts aside and got ready for the day. As I stepped out of my room, I nearly collided with him in the hallway. He smiled, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't been in my room just hours ago. "Morning," he said casually. I forced a nod, my throat too dry to respond. I wanted to run, to put as much distance between us as possible, but my mother called me into the kitchen before I could escape. There, on the table, was a small, neatly wrapped box with a ribbon tied around it. "Daniel got you something," my mother said, beaming. "An early birthday present." I stared at the box, my stomach twisting. I hadn't told him my birthday was coming up. Slowly, I unwrapped it, revealing a delicate silver necklace with a small heart-shaped pendant. It was beautiful, but something about it made my skin crawl. "Go on, try it," he urged, his voice softer than usual. I hesitated but picked it up with trembling fingers, slipping it over my neck. The metal felt cold against my skin. "It looks perfect on you," he said, his eyes lingering a little too long. My mother, oblivious, smiled and kissed his cheek. I wanted to take it off, but I didn't want to cause a scene. I swallowed my discomfort and mumbled a thank you, forcing a smile. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of the necklace felt unbearable, like a chain rather than a gift. I kept thinking about how he had been in my room, how he had watched me, how he had given me something so personal. A soft knock at my door made my heart stop. I lay frozen, not daring to move. Then, the doorknob turned slightly, but the door didn't open. "Good night," his voice murmured through the wood, barely above a whisper. I clenched my jaw, refusing to answer. A moment later, I heard footsteps retreating down the hall. Tears pricked my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This wasn't just in my head. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. The following days were unbearable. I felt his presence everywhere, watching, waiting. My mother remained blissfully unaware, wrapped up in the illusion of a perfect marriage. I tried to act normal, but inside, I was drowning in unease. One evening, I was in the living room when he sat down beside me, closer than necessary. My body stiffened. "You've grown into a beautiful young woman," he said, his voice calm, deliberate. A chill ran down my spine. I forced a nervous laugh, shifting away slightly, but he didn't move. "You know, sometimes people find connections in the most unexpected places," he continued, his eyes lingering on me. My stomach turned. I wanted to run, but my feet felt cemented to the floor. "You can talk to me about anything," he said, his tone softer now. "I understand you in ways others don't." My fingers dug into the fabric of the couch. Every word felt calculated, carefully placed to blur the lines between what was acceptable and what wasn't. I needed to get away. I muttered something about homework and practically sprinted to my room, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing. This wasn't just in my head, he was pushing boundaries, testing how much he could get away with. I called my best friend, my voice barely above a whisper, as I explained everything. She didn't hesitate. "That's not normal," she said firmly. "You need to set boundaries. Now." The thought of confronting him terrified me, but the idea of letting this continue was worse. I decided to tell my mother, hoping she would listen. The next morning, I sat her down, my hands trembling. I told her everything, the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, the way he made me feel. Her expression hardened. "You're overreacting," she said, shaking her head. "Daniel loves you like his own daughter. You're misinterpreting things." I felt my chest tighten. "You don't believe me?" My voice cracked. She sighed. "You're young. Sometimes men are just friendly. Don't read into things too much." Tears burned my eyes, but I swallowed them down. There was no point arguing. She had already made up her mind. I walked away, feeling completely alone. If my own mother wouldn't believe me, who would? I had no choice but to protect myself. This wouldn't end unless I ended it. I knew I couldn't rely on anyone but myself. If my mother refused to see the truth, I had to make her see it. I needed proof, something undeniable. That night, I left my phone recording on my nightstand, screen down, microphone on. I didn't know if he would come, but something in my gut told me he would. Hours passed. Then, just past midnight, the door creaked open. My pulse pounded in my ears as I kept my breathing steady, pretending to be asleep. I could hear him step inside, hear the sound of his breathing. A long pause. Then a whisper. "You're special, you know that?" My stomach churned. I clenched my jaw, resisting the urge to react. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he continued. "I only want to take care of you." My fingers curled into fists under the covers. I wanted to scream, to throw him out, but I needed this moment. I needed proof. After a few seconds, he finally stepped back, the door clicking shut behind him. I waited until I was sure he was gone before reaching for my phone with shaking hands. The recording was still running. The next morning, I didn't say a word to him. I barely acknowledged my mother. Instead, I sent the recording to my best friend, who immediately called me. "Play it for her," she said. "She can't ignore this." I took a deep breath, knowing this was my only chance. When my mother came home that evening, I asked her to sit down. I pressed play. The color drained from her face. She stared at the phone, then at me, her hands trembling. She started, but the words never came. I saw it in her eyes, the denial, the disbelief, and then, finally, the realization. That night, she confronted him. Voices rose, doors slammed, but I didn't care. I stayed in my room, gripping the necklace he had given me before yanking it off and throwing it into the trash. By morning, he was gone. My mother didn't speak much after that. She was heartbroken, ashamed, and struggling to face the truth. But for the first time in weeks, I could breathe again. I moved out a few months later, determined to put it all behind me. It wasn't easy, but I refused to let his actions define me. Some scars remain, but I learned something important. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't crazy. And most importantly, I wasn't alone.